Welcome to our Week 4 discussion of a case called Korematsu versus the United States. Let's talk a little bit first about Article 2 in general and some of the powers granted to the president. Article 2 deals mostly with election and removal and not with the powers of the president. There is not a lot of specificity about what powers the president has, and those that he is provided are vague at best. For example, there's a reference to the executive power. What that power is precisely is not well defined except in terms of he is the commander-in-chief, which we can find in Article 2, Section 2, very first words. And also there is an admonition in Article 2, Section 3, that the president faithfully execute the laws of the United States. But none of those terms are defined. What is then the executive power? Well, there are two theories of the executive power, neither one of which is contained in the Constitution. The Constitution does not articulate a theory of executive power, but the first is that the executive power is a designation of office, and therefore the powers of the president are limited in scope. They are limited to only those powers that can be properly inferred by the authority of Congress, the bringing into effect, the actual execution of the will of the legislature. The other theory is that the executive power is a general grant of power, and that the president has what's called plenary power, or the fullest extent of power, to do those things that are necessary to preserve and prosper the United States, to achieve the mission of Congress, and then also to defend the United States and its borders against external threats or internal civil insurrection, and then also to represent the United States in the realm of foreign policy. So the first is very limited in scope, limited to only those things that can be properly inferred from statements about the president's power, and there's not much there. The second is a very broad grant of power to the president, a very expansive role. The second one rests on the idea of residual powers. In other words, nations exist. They exist in a state of nature with other nations, and so thus the powers of the president cannot be specified in any great detail, and that's why the framers didn't do so. For example, Section 3, the faithfully execute clause, can be interpreted in terms of the president's residual powers. In other words, the framers recognized that the president had residual powers, and these things were fair implications of the existence of the Union, and there's just this admonition that he faithfully execute the laws without much of a statement of it. So instead of limiting the scope of his powers, the faithfully execute clause actually expands them. So in terms of the president's power over foreign policy, he's given special authority. The Supreme Court has recognized in United States versus Curtis Wright that the president is the sole organ of foreign policy, and that sometimes this means he must take control over the domestic sphere. He is the commander-in-chief, and the commander-in-chief deals with the armed forces both as they exist within the domestic realm and also in terms of their actual conflict and combat and diplomatic missions and other sorts of things in terms of the foreign policy realm. The president also has the power to make treaties. So the president can kind of get us into a treaty. I mean, he can make the United States a signature on a treaty. Of course, that has to be ratified and approved by the Senate. But one thing I don't note here that you should also remember is that the president is the only organ of government that can get us out of a treaty. The Constitution doesn't say anything about when we can get out of treaties, and so the president is the one actually who makes that decision. And the president also has the power to appoint ambassadors to fulfill the diplomatic mission of the United States, and then also to receive ambassadors to verify their credentials and recognize them as the representative of foreign governments in the United States. So this brings us to United States versus Curtiss-Wright Export Company. I just want to review this a little bit before we get on into Korematsu. In this case, which we've already discussed, the Supreme Court recognized that the president alone has the power to speak or listen as a representative of the nation, and that the president doesn't get this power from an act of Congress, but from the Constitution. And the Constitution grants it to him in the broadest terms possible. So Congress doesn't have to give the president the power to act, doesn't have to create legislation with respect to how we deal with nations, and then the president puts it into effect. No, the president gets that power not from Congress, but from the Constitution itself. Okay, so one of the times that brought about the greatest crisis, both internationally and domestically for the United States, was World War II. I guess I would say that other than the Civil War, the United States was in the greatest upheaval domestically as a result of World War II than any other war that we've been in. And so this caused the president to have to rely upon these implied powers, these executive powers that are solely his alone. And the primary reason for that was because the United States was attacked by a foreign power, by the Japanese Empire. And there was great fear in the United States that the Japanese would be attacking the west coast of the United States, actually invading the mainland of the United States. There are a number of cases that occurred in World War II in which the Supreme Court ratified the president's ability to rely solely upon his own powers when acting in the foreign policy realm. For example, ex parte Quirin. In this case, some Nazi SS officers were arrested in Jacksonville, Florida, and Detroit, Michigan. They were spies in the United States, and the president decided that he would try them in military tribunals. They objected. They thought they should be tried in civilian court. But the Supreme Court said, no, the president has the power to do this. And furthermore, Congress has recognized it. It didn't give him the power, but it recognized his power when it included a statement in the United States Military Code. So the court decided this case differently from Milligan, and we talked a little bit about Milligan. That was a case involving a man who was arrested in the United States proper, in the civil sphere. He was arrested in Indiana. There had never been, I think there was one skirmish in Indiana during the Civil War. And the civilian courts were open, and the court decided ex parte Quirin differently because Milligan wasn't a spy, and those Nazis who were arrested were. In Hirabayashi versus United States, the main question in this case was whether the United States military, whether the president, through the United States military, could impose a curfew on all Japanese Americans and persons of Japanese origin. And the Supreme Court said that that was okay, that it was during a time of war, and that the president had the power to do such a thing. Justice Stone explained that the war powers doctrine, which is a doctrine based almost solely on the president's executive power, that gave the government ample authority to impose restrictions. And the reason for that was because of the grave threat posed by the possibility of war. This case led us to our current case that we're going to discuss, Korematsu versus United States. So in this case, you need to know that it was not about Korematsu being sent to an internment camp or a concentration camp. No, it was about the step that occurred right before that. He needed to report to a relocation center, and he had failed to do so. That's important because later the court says this isn't about race, and you shouldn't call these camps concentration camps. So the question in this case was, may the president order the internment of all persons suspected of being of Japanese ancestry, and that included United States citizens who had been born here, naturalized citizens of Japanese origin, and also resident aliens. And the court said, yes, the president may order their internment or their reporting to a relocation camp by a 6-3 vote, and Justice Hugo Black wrote the majority opinion. The court says, we are dealing with nothing more here than an exclusion order to protect the country. There is evidence that some citizens of Japanese ancestry were disloyal. It's very difficult to determine who they are when Japanese are mixed up into the general population, and therefore the action to segregate them was necessary to determine which were loyal and which were not, and to hold them until after the conclusion of hostilities. So here was the logic of the court in this case. Justice Black he announces a test that becomes the basis for all civil rights claims based on racial classification, and that's called strict scrutiny. And he does this right at the very beginning of the excerpt in your text. He says, any racial classification will be immediately suspect. In other words, the court will suspect that classification of being unconstitutional, and then it will subject the law to the strictest of scrutiny. What does that scrutiny look like? Well, first of all, the burden is on government to show that the classification is justified by a compelling interest. So if government is going to classify based on race, it has to have a compelling interest, and then it has to narrowly tailor or narrowly apply its policy to achieve that interest. So in Korematsu wasn't bearing the burden. The United States government bore the burden to show that the exclusion order, the order to forcing all Japanese to report to relocation centers and then from there to be processed and sent to camps, was compelling. Who wins? The United States government. Justice Black says the government has met its burden. It's borne its burden. War is a compelling interest, and the restriction of Japanese was not made out of racial hatred, but from fear for national security. And thus it is justified, and the interest is compelling, and it is narrowly applied because the United States can't determine which Japanese are loyal and which are not, and so excluding all of them is rational. After Korematsu, the court made some interesting rulings. So in a case called Ex parte Endo, decided on the same day as Korematsu, the court said that if the United States government creates a set of rules to determine the loyalty of a Japanese citizen and says, if you sign this loyalty document, you may leave the concentration camp, and then the person proves their loyalty and leaves the concentration camp, they cannot be arrested again and put in the concentration camp for being disloyal. In other words, the United States has to follow its own rules. Also, in 1988, the United States government paid reparations to the persons and families of those who were placed in internment camps. Apparently Congress was, I guess, not admitting fault, but admitting that doing such a thing was harmful. But there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that prevents the United States government from doing precisely the same thing during a time of national crisis, of grave national concern. So that is Korematsu versus United States. Thank you very much.